Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Matt Ludmer, and I'm the founder of the Aligned Center and Aligned Wealth. And I want to welcome our members, and I want to welcome those who may be new to the Aligned Center. Needless to say, we are very excited about the class that's going to go on here. It's going to be an amazing few weeks. Just to have Steve to have this opportunity to be at the center and to talk about all he knows. I was really changed after I read this book, so I'm just so happy he's here. Before I introduce Steve, I just want to say the why and how of how this became about. And it's just been in a crazy year. The polarization has been like I've never seen it before politically, between the BLM protests, the presidential and the congressional election, storming the Capitol, the Senate acquittal, the impeachment. It's been overwhelming. And, we kept on thinking, Carolyn and I, what can we do? What can we do as a center that can make a difference? So a few weeks ago, we invited Steve to do an aligned living conversation with us, and it was a great hit. And he spoke about developmental politics, and we got a lot of great feedback. It was obvious to us that Steve had a lot more to say, and he couldn't just say that in one session. So Caroline, who's the Institute director, and I decided to invite Steve to discuss the topic for a much deeper dive. And we're just very thankful that Steve said, okay, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that. It's a big thing for us to have you here. I have to say, I want to thank everyone for being here, because we're really in this conversation at the evolutionary edge of political and cultural thinking. And it's encouraging to see so many people who are asking the same question, to understand how to heal, how to further evolve our politics in a way that's more true, beautiful, and good. How do we do that? And I'm just hoping to find all the answers, or more answers that I've heard over the next few weeks. Let me introduce Steve. This is an abbreviated bio. Steve won't let me do a full bio of him, so I'm going to do the abbreviated version.
I already read it.
That he said it's okay for me to do, so I'll say it. Steve is the president of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, an integral political think tank. He's the author of the recent book, Developmental Politics. And of course, that's the basis for this course. He's been a prominent proponent of evolutionary thinking for over 20 years. He's authored 3 previous books on integral thinking. Steve's trained as a lawyer before becoming a political philosopher, which what he is, he's a great political philosopher. He had a variety of other successful careers. That's all Steve's allowing me to say, but there's a lot about Steve that you'll see over the next few weeks. As those know who are Aligned Center members, I ask you for one thing, and that is the safe space to have these conversations. We're going to be doing 9 sessions, and this is a real opportunity to explore with love and compassion our views and exchange views. And, the center is really built on having an open mind and an open heart. That's what this community is all about. So it's such good fortune that we can have this conversation with Steve in this way. It's kind of, I don't know, it's just, I feel really privileged to, be part of this, and very grateful. As many of you know, Albert Einstein said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. And for sure, this is a different way of thinking that we're going to be learning about. So what my hope is that we can lay the groundwork for a true, meaningful change. I don't know where else I've heard this kind of conversation. It's evolution, it's political evolution. And there's this glimpse, this small glimpse of what true unity can actually look like. And let that fire that starts here build and build and build and go way beyond this class. So thank you, Steve. Thanks for doing this. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Matt, very much for the Aligned Center, a major fruit of the spirit, as I've said. And thank you, Caroline, for being my assistant in the course and generally holding the focus for us. Let me say to all of you that I'm really pleased and even honored that you've joined this course. You have sussed out what I believe is one of the leading edges of development, and so I'm honored to be with you and grateful, as Matt has so elegantly put. So let's start with the why. Why I'm teaching this class, perhaps why you've signed up for it, right? The across the developed world, but in America especially, we're experiencing something more than what we might call polarization. What we have experienced really over the last several years is the tearing of the fabric of our society. There's like this torn social fabric that's very dangerous, not only for our politics, but for our democracy as a whole. Democracy is based on compromise. And if people no longer have common goals, if they can't compromise with each other, or they don't want to compromise, they want to fight, then the system, the brilliant system that our founding fathers created 200 odd years ago won't function, right? It's meant for a polity that has a sense of common purpose, or a coherent set of common purposes. And the fact that we've been disrupted, and we've, as I'll talk further when I get to my talk, that the society has evolved significantly in the last 50 years, but unevenly, right? The joke is that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so this stretching out of our culture through growth is part of the way we can understand how things have gotten so hyperpolarized. But both the why and the how is something that we'll be returning to and elaborating on throughout the course. But it's just important to start and put a stake in the ground and say, this is important because the future of American democracy is important for human history. So that's the first why. Not only is the stretching out, the disintegration of our culture the result of growth, the solution, I would say, I'm going to argue, and I hope to demonstrate, is to grow further, to grow into a better version of ourselves. And while that might at first sound rather idealistic or merely aspirational, the details of how the growth that has gotten to where we are, understanding the development of our civilization and our culture, that points clearly to the not only the strategy but the tactics of how we can foster and cultivate the further growth we need, not to grow back into some perfect unity, but to grow into a functional polity wherein democracy can function in a as it was designed to do. Right. The joke is that the U.S. government was designed by geniuses so that it could be safely run by idiots, and the genius of that design is dependent upon a degree of commonality of purpose, and so that's at least the beginning of an understanding of where we're going in terms of the growth that we hope to foster both in ourselves and then outward by circles into the larger society. So let me say just a word about process. The value of this course is going to be co-created, right? I may have thought about this stuff a lot more than most, but we're all citizens. I'm not sure whether everyone here is an American citizen, but wherever you live, you're a citizen. And as a citizen, you have valid opinions about politics and about what's wrong and what's right and how we can fix things. So I'm very much interested in hearing from you about that. Not only questions and comments, but challenges, right? This is politics, and there's no way that we're all going to agree. I certainly don't expect you all to agree with me or my political positions, but I do hope to show how this developmental perspective, which developmental politics is all about, which is the focus of the Institute for Cultural Evolution think tank, this developmental approach to politics and society at large, I hope to persuade you that this is an expanded way of knowing that's very useful, not only for our role as citizens, but for just about every aspect of our lives. So to get this highly interactive course started, tonight we're gonna do introductions. less than a minute apiece. There's over 36 or 37 folks here signed up, so we want to go quick, but it's very important that we get a sense of knowing each other. We're going to be doing a lot of breakout groups. One of the participants is Lucy West, who's an education expert, and Lucy consulted with us about how to make a Zoom course really take advantage of the Zoom's capabilities, and to make it so that you'll get much more out of it than watching a static podcast or reading a book. So the interactivity of the class is built into it, and every week we're going to have at least 2 group discussions, which can be questions and answers to me, but also crosstalk among the group. We'll have an opportunity for one of those at the beginning of every week. I mean, not this week, but the beginning of every week and at the end of every week. And really, I'm at my best when I'm answering questions. So hopefully we can spend a lot of time and make that interesting and complex. Every week I'll also give 2 talks. The typical schedule will be a 20. We'll gather, we'll have an open discussion about last week and questions people may have had, and then I'll give about a 20-minute talk. Sometimes I'll have slides, sometimes I won't. Then from that talk, there'll be a question posed. You'll be put into breakout groups, most often in triads of 3 people, and you get a chance to discuss the posed question or the subject in general with your course mates. Then after the breakout group, we'll have a questions and discussions, and then I'll do another one. Tonight, because we're going to take 35 minutes or so for the introductions, my introductory talks will be much shorter than normal, but we'll still have the breakout groups and opportunities for questions and discussion. It's also important to say that I know some of you pretty well, but I don't know most of you, and I very much look forward to getting to know you, and hopefully that some of the relationships that form during this course will blossom into longer-term friendships. I certainly would love to be friends with anybody who takes my course. But just looking at the list of folks who've signed up, my sense is that there's quite a few people who are new to developmental thinking, or what's sometimes called integral philosophy, and that's great. I'm going to gear almost all of my all of my remarks to folks who are new to this. But we also have some fairly advanced students of integral philosophy. I want to serve both groups. What I can say to the advanced students is that although you may be familiar with spiral dynamics or integral philosophy, the approach I take to the subject of framing it, of introducing it, of applying it is fresh and new. So I hope that you'll be edified by this fresh approach to describing this developmental perspective. And for folks that are new, although I'm gearing my remarks to you, during the questions, I want to encourage all questions, including sort of sophisticated questions for more advanced students of this material. And if the answers I give to those questions, for those of you who are new, are not entirely understandable, they will be, I promise, as the course proceeds. And sometimes it's good to hear questions and answers that you don't know entirely. It's like a little preview of coming attractions. But I'll also point to elements in the syllabus where we'll be covering. So we'll be covering, more detail on worldviews next week, and further detail on polarities the following week. So a lot of the things we're going to touch on tonight are going to be explained in much greater depth as the course unfolds. So let's start by introducing ourselves. I want you to take a minute or less. I want you to tell us your name, tell us where you're from, tell us where you live now, and tell us just some brief fact about yourself that you think we might appreciate, just something by which we might remember you. And Caroline, if you could model the introduction by starting and then calling on people as we go.
So,
okay, well, thanks, Caroline, and thanks for everyone for sharing a little bit about yourselves. So in the hour that we have left tonight, I want to try to deliver 2 short talks. Normally the 2 talks I deliver will be longer, but the first one is sort of just an introduction, more content rich than what we've talked about so far. And the second one is about what we're trying to achieve, and that starts with a perspective, an outside and above perspective. So I'll explain both of those. But let me start this session, which will be followed by a breakout, and then we'll take some questions. We'll see how fast things go. We'll definitely leave time for questions and discussion after these two talks and their accompanying breakouts. But any questions that you don't get a chance to ask, or questions that you think of after the fact, we're going to begin next week with actually an assignment to ask a question or bring a question to talk to get things going. So there's abundant opportunities for everybody to talk. But let me start things out by saying that we have a lot of titles. What is this? What's the subject of this, right? We're calling it becoming part of the solution, of course, in post-progressive politics. But there's many other competing names. It's almost like, the Eskimos have 30 words for snow. We have 30 words for what this is we're talking about. Some people are used to talking about in terms of integral politics, and that's certainly an accurate label. The book that's the foundation of the course, I call it Developmental Politics, a little bit taking off of the idea of developmental psychology. But this is, I actually have a critique of developmental psychology at the end of the book. But it's developmental in the sense that we're looking at politics and recognizing that it's in the process of unfolding and growing, and understanding that growth is the key to the growth we need to help foster and cultivate, as I mentioned at the beginning. So other terms, the term post-progressive politics is another label, although I quickly need to add that this perspective on politics is not anti-progressive. There's a lot of folks now who are landing, I think, valid critiques against progressivism, some of its excesses. But I also I want to honor progressivism, and post-progressivism attempts to include all the best of progressivism in something that transcends and includes it. So we want to be friendly not only to progressivism, but to modernity and traditionalism, and to all the political views of people who have good sense and good faith. So among the various titles for this, I think the one that works best for the introduction is to call it, or refer to it as, a politics of culture. And it's a politics of culture because that's where the focus is, because as I will emphasize and argue throughout the course, that the reason that we're hyperpolarized, although there have been many theses of why that is, and all of them have a piece of the truth, I would say, but from my perspective, from this developmental perspective, the reason that our society has become polarized is that our culture has evolved, and it's evolved in a way that that we now have a spectrum of values. And I want to emphasize throughout that that everyone's values are valid. That's sort of the key to the whole method of this, is recognizing that while our views may not align, our political interests may not align, our political parties certainly don't align, but the idea that at the level of values, at the level of bedrock values, it becomes possible to create an integration. Not a meeting in the middle or a centrism, but a way in which the bitterly divided political hatreds that characterize our current cultural condition, part of the way we can evolve into a more inclusive perspective is to understand the level of values, because that brings the ability to have sympathy, empathy, understanding, because an authentic intrinsic value that someone holds deep down, that's a value that ultimately can be shared by everybody. So we're another way of talking about it might be a politics of values, but values has got its limitations as a word. Some people associate it with kind of stodgy ideas. So we're talking about a politics of culture, and we want to help culture evolve by staking out this perspective, this outside and above perspective, which I'll elaborate on in the other talk I'm going to do tonight. But for this talk, when I talk about culture, I'm talking about the idea that the conflict, the heart of the conflict, is upstream from politics. Like a lot of the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of pundits who try to opine on our hyper-polarized condition is to focus on politicians behaving badly, if they could just compromise for the greater good. Or the idea that the reason that we're polarized is because half the country is racist, right? That's one explanation. But I don't think that's the case. I would say certainly there are people of bad faith in both sides of the spectrum, but it's the people of good faith, the vast majority of Americans and other citizens of the developed world, who I think will benefit significantly from this cultural political perspective. So because culture is in some ways the theme of the course, it's important for me to define what I mean by culture, very kind of a squishy word. But I'm following the basic dictionary definition of culture. So for example, dictionary.com has 3 overlapping definitions of culture, right? 1, the quality in a person or society that can discern excellence in the arts, letters, manners, scholarly pursuits, so being cultured and being sophisticated is one definition. 2, this is from dictionary.com, a particular form or stage of civilization as that of a certain nation or period. And so this is one of the first times in history that we have a nation like the United States where we have more than one dominant worldview. There's not one worldview is holding the focus for the rest of the culture. There's this intense competition, and it's not simply a competition between left and right, as I'll explain further in a while. That's a woefully inadequate conception, even though we're going to have to touch on it just to sort of connect what we're talking about to what you see on the news. But it's not a simple division between left and right, as I'll explain a lot further next week. The third definition of culture from dictionary.com is development or improvement of the mind by education or training, right? So Joshua Rothman, writing in the New Yorker, he writes about this. He's got a whole article about the definition of culture and the battleground of meaning that this word stands for. And he writes, many people have called culture a loose or confused term. It's possible to imagine a more rational system in which one word describes the activities of artistic and intellectual life, another our group identity, and a third our implicit norms and ways of living. Those terms, whatever they might be, would be narrower and simpler, but they also be less accurate. They would obscure the overlap between life, art, and politics. So culture is what you think it is, but we hope that by the end of the course, you'll have an understanding of culture because you'll be able to see it in action. You'll be able to see it in development, and ultimately, from an integral perspective, that's what culture is. It's a process of development. And so this is a subject that's a theme we'll be returning to. I think it's also important to say that this may be counterintuitive, but the idea of developmental politics, or this politics of culture, it's not a thesis of unity, right? So certainly bipartisan unity is good where you can get it, and Joe Biden has pledged to be a unifier, and I certainly hope he can get as much unification done as possible. But I also think that there's a kind of a misunderstanding of the problem to suggest that we just need to unify, because that's ultimately a thesis of centrism. And as I'll explain, centrism fails for a whole variety of reasons. And again, it's commendable, it's certainly supportable, but I don't think it's politically pragmatic, right? Otto von Bismarck, right? The famous quote, "Politics is the art of the possible." So in all of these political discussions, my aim is to try to connect the ideal with the real, not to just become cynical and transactional about it, but also recognize that part of the virtue of politics is that it forces us to deal with what is and to work with the folks who are in the democratic process that we share. So it's not a thesis of unity, and it's important, I think, to say that there's a whole bunch of different organizations. Not only are there a whole bunch of different opinions about what's causing polarization, but there's also a variety of nonprofit organizations, kind of a cottage industry of them, that are working to overcome hyperpolarization in one way or another. And I also applaud the work of these organizations. Some are trying to get people to talk to each other. It's sort of a mediation strategy with the background assumption that the left and the right are in a bad marriage. And if we could just have a kind of a marriage counseling, they'll see that they need each other and that they'll start to work together and that the animosity can be cooled. And so there's a variety of organizations that are doing this sort of mediation strategy approach. Braver Angels is one organization that conducts workshops with folks who are on the right and the left, and gets them in weekend situations where they can talk to each other. And there's also organizations that have been around for decades, like the National Center for Civil Discourse, right? The idea that we can just get people to talk to each other, that the animosity that they have toward each other is somewhat artificially created. And so I support and applaud all the different organizational efforts to achieve this thesis of unity through mediation. But ultimately, I think, as I'll explain as we go, I think it's a kind of a misguided strategy. I don't think it has a very reasonable chance of addressing the problem at the source. The other category, I mean, there's a variety of them, but the other main category of the nonprofits that are in this realm of working on hyperpolarization is to focus on structural reforms. And there's a whole series of structural reforms: getting money out of politics, reducing congressional district gerrymandering, bringing on ranked choice voting, and all of these structural solutions to our political polarization, I think, again, are commendable. But my critique of this approach and the notion of the politics industry, how we need to reform the politics industry, this is a version of the structural approach. And there's quite a few well-funded organizations working on that. Again, I applaud their work. But my critique of the structural approach is that while all of those may be great ideas, right? Reforming campaign finance, bringing on ranked choice voting, depoliticizing the congressional districts, all of those would definitely make a positive difference in depolarizing America. And while they're all good ideas, they all, in some ways, presuppose that the polarization we're seeking to overcome has already been overcome. As if we can just put out there a really good idea for overcoming polarization that involves legislation and structural changes, and people will be persuaded by the logic of it. And the trouble is that, for example, when they go down to the southern part of Colorado that's very red, and they talk to people about ranked choice voting, they're not really interested in the idea of ranked choice voting. They're interested in what the result of ranked choice voting would be, because they're suspicious that this structural reform is ultimately a way for the Democrats to gain power. So it's very much this cultural problem, the political hatreds that people are experiencing, that we'd have to solve those at the level of culture before we'd have enough of a bipartisan political will to enact the kind of structural reforms that are being proposed as the solution. So they kind of presuppose the solution. I applaud them, but I ultimately don't think they're the right place to start. The joke is you've probably heard the joke of the drunk who lost his keys at night, and he's looking for them on the street, and he's looking for them under the street light, and a cop comes up and asks him what he's doing. He says, "I lost my keys, I'm looking for them." And so the cop's helping him look for the keys, and they look around, and he said, "Well, where'd you last see them? Where'd you lose your keys?" And I said, "Well, I lost them in the park." And the cop says, "Well, why are we looking for them here?" He said, "Well, this is where the light is." And so these strategies of mediation or structural reform, that's where the light is, that's where the good ideas seem to be. But the cultural approach is sort of dark and murky, and that's one of the main benefits of this integral or developmental approach to the subject, is that we're able to recognize culture with new clarity. And when we can see culture, when we can see it moving, then that illuminates the way to the further cultural evolution we need to grow into a better version of ourselves. So just to close this brief talk, I want to say that our our focus is on overcoming polarization. And one of the key themes that's going to animate every class is this focus on polarities themselves, right? Several people mentioned they like the idea of the physics of value or the physics of consciousness. And of course, physics implies that it's material. So it's we're borrowing the term. I have to kind of say, pardon the term, but it does resonate with folks. They get a sense that there are these behaviors, and structural relationships that are in the internal realm of consciousness and culture, and that they can be compared to physics, but I'm not trying to claim that values or consciousness are physical things. Nevertheless, polarities are all over the place. Any up, down, in, out, almost any difference you can identify, you might call it a polarity. But I'm in this course and in this philosophy, when we talk about polarity, we're talking about a defined term, something very specific. And that has to do with things that are intrinsically valuable. The more intrinsically valuable, either a value in itself or something that creates value, an activity generating value, anything that has to do with value, when we get to the most intrinsic aspects of those values, of any individual intrinsic value, we find that it's connected in a system with a complementary and opposing value. So to be specific, the classic polarity that illustrates this point is liberty and equality, right? This was the French slogan, right, that they began the revolution with, the rallying cry, liberty, equality, fraternity. And fraternity might be seen as, in some ways, the balance of liberty and equality. But just looking at liberty and equality as a prime example of an interdependent value polarity that's indestructible, it keeps arising. Like you might be able to say, we're going to achieve perfect equality. But that can't last long, because ultimately, to achieve perfect equality, you're going to have to trample on liberty. Or if we're going to say we're going to be completely free and we're going to have a society that maximizes liberty, it won't be long before we have gross inequality that challenges the value-creating capacity of liberty itself. And so from the perspective of this value technology, if you will, understanding this behavior, it's almost like the physics, like a circuit that naturally occurs. Liberty and equality are interdependent in the sense that equality, the capacity of the ideal of equality to create value and make the world a better place is partially dependent on a relationship of challenge and support with the value of liberty, that they have to work together and moderate each other. Ideally they support each other, but they also need to challenge each other, or taken to the extreme, either of these poles disconnected from the other can become pathological. Other important illustrations of this key concept we'll be using throughout the course about polarization. Other value polarities, I'll sort of tick them off slowly. One is objective and subjective, right? The world out there and the world in here. Another one would be the real and the ideal. I mentioned that. If you're too much of a realist, you can become cynical. If you're too much of an idealist, you can become disconnected from the ability to make the world a better place. You may just become a dreamer. But when real and ideal, these two propositions of value in a way, when they are brought into a relationship of challenge and support, so we want to make things more ideal, but we have to keep bringing it down to the level of the real, and that illustrates the dynamism, the back and forth. These polarities function like two legs. So each leg has to move forward on its own terms, even while it's supported by the other leg. Simple and complex, part and whole, or individual and community. Competition and cooperation. Justice and mercy. That's an interdependent, indestructible polarity which is very much missing in our current discourse. Folks are focused on justice, but you don't see much mercy in cancel culture, and I think ideally justice itself, the quest for justice, can become pathological in its own way if it's not coupled with mercy, if it's not moderated by concern for the circumstances of the individual and not just the rights and needs of the larger society. Challenge and support itself. is an example of an interdependent polarity. Like when I parent my sons, I want to love them, I want to give them total support, but I don't want to spoil them. I want to challenge them to be the best they can be. But I don't want to be, a tiger father. I want them to feel nurtured and cared for and loved for who they are, not just for what they can do. Of course, yang and yin, many are familiar with that. To a certain extent, masculine and feminine. I don't mean men and women, but these principles of masculine and feminine do illustrate this indestructible polarity, and we can talk about the deeper philosophy that why does value cohere in these interdependent polarities. I look forward to talking about that with you in week 3. And then, I guess, in addition to real and ideal and liberty and equality, the other key polarity that I really want you to keep in mind, for especially in any discussion of politics, is grievance and gratitude. I love the alliteration, right? So politics is all about grievance, especially right now, right? We're pissed off. If you're on the right, you're pissed off. If you're on the left, you're pissed off. And there's certainly many good reasons to be discontented with the current state of things from all different perspectives. But the idea that our grievances, the ability to generate value with a grievance or a complaint, according to this theory of polarities, is itself in an interdependent relationship with gratitude, right? We don't want to just be Pollyanna. We don't want to be in so much gratitude that we can't see how things can be better. We don't want to just accept the status quo. But we don't want to be so concerned about making things better that we forget to appreciate the good that's already been achieved. And this sort of brings us to, in a sense, the prime political polarity. I'm contradicting myself by saying that in this discussion we're going to look at the political spectrum. We're going to try to transcend the idea of left and right, because we've sort of grown out of that very conception, even though the media is habituated to it, and certainly we have two parties, so it's not entirely wrong, but I don't want to dwell there, or I want to keep pointing our view to a higher perspective than left and right. But part of the reason that we find that not only in America in our hyperpolarized condition, but in almost every single human polity, whether it's the Rotary Club or an ancient indigenous tribe, it seems as though, and I don't know how much empirical support for this idea there is, but there's certainly lots of common sense support for it. And it just seems like whenever you have human groups that are deliberating about political ideas of one kind or another, you seem to have a split. And that split between folks who are oriented toward the left or folks who are oriented toward the right, there's a growing body of very interesting research that shows how part of that might be heritable. In the same way that humans are naturally born as, half males and half females approximately, biologically, it seems like that there is a biological basis. It's not determinative. People, regardless of how you're born, you can end up in a different place politically. But these proclivities that are baked in to our evolutionary psychology and maybe even into our biology can be understood as that some folks are most focused on fixing what's wrong, and another group of folks are naturally most concerned about preserving what's right. And these can flip. There's certainly examples of people on the left who are about preserving what's right, and vice versa. But if we come to understand that this is an indestructible, basic polarity, there's something essentially right and beautiful about the fact that things divide this way. And as I'll explain, this division is not just across left and right. There's this polarity of those who want to preserve what's right and those who want to fix what's wrong. Grievance and gratitude is maybe a way of talking about it in shorthand. That this actually appears fractally, self-similarly. It's across the spectrum and it's within the spectrum because it's within us. And so the idea of a developmental perspective, or the perspective that we hope to achieve from this course, is that whatever preferred pole you have within yourself, whether your orientation is toward fixing what's wrong or your orientation is on preserving what's right, the idea is that we can embody this polarity more completely within ourselves, that we can do both, and that in some ways there's a principle here that the best way to forward the value of when you have an interdependent polarity, the best way to forward the value of your preferred pole is to affirm the intrinsic values of the pole you oppose. So I'll illustrate that principle throughout. We'll keep coming back to it. This is just an introduction. But just to sort of lay the groundwork for this natural division and the opportunity that we have to grow in our own consciousness by embodying the division in its entirety within us. So let me finish by saying that throughout my life, I've been very fascinated, obsessed, one might even say, with renaissances in history, not just the Renaissance in Europe, but periods of cultural fluorescence, hundreds of them that have now been identified in the historical record. I've studied these. I felt drawn since I was a teenager because I had a sense that I was being called to participate in a renaissance in my own time. And when I discovered integral philosophy, it seemed like the yearning for a renaissance that I had all my life was being fulfilled, that this was it, this is what I was looking for, this is the next renaissance. It's just emerging now. It may take decades or longer to fully mature and come into view and for the larger society, but it's very exciting to me. And the more I've studied it, the more I've written and devoted the last more than 20 years of my life to participating in this exciting emergence, the more I see that it's really coming to pass now. And the place where it's coming to pass most poignantly is in politics, right? We would joke for the last 20 years that integral was a solution to a problem that people didn't know they had. Nobody really wants a new worldview. They want their worldview to triumph. But now with the torn fabric of our society, now with the intense hyperpolarization that we're experiencing, people are beginning to recognize that we have a problem, and all of the solutions that you see in the mainstream, those are not adequate solutions, in my opinion. And so this perspective on development does, I think, provide a satisfactory and promising solution to the problem of hyperpolarization. Maybe the better word is amelioration, right? We're never going to get rid of the polarity, but we can make it more functional, we can make it more interdependent, we can restore this relationship of challenge and support, which is how a healthy polarity is managed. And so I want to just take a couple minutes now and do our first breakout group. Caroline is going to break you out into triads. It'll be around 6 minutes. Well, the question I'd pose, or what I want you each in your group to talk about for about 2 minutes, and try to be aware of time so everybody gets the same amount of time to talk, is beyond what you said in your introduction, if you mentioned this, what drew you to this course? What do you hope to get out of it? And why are you interested in politics in general and the torn fabric of our society and our hyperpolarized politics in particular? So let's do a breakout, and then we'll come back in 6 minutes or so.
Great. I think everyone's back. Thank you so much.
Okay, welcome back. Let me say that a part of tonight's first class is to break the ice a little bit, to create the we space that we want to create. People get to know each other, and the sense of being in this group together will be important for for our own sense of intimacy. But the train's just leaving the station, right? It's starting to roll out. It's slow. It'll gain momentum, and the juiciness of the breakout sessions will get better and better, I trust, as we proceed. And so what we're going to do now is I have about, I'll try to keep this short, maybe 7 to 10 minutes more of material I want to talk about. And then we'll have, we'll just open it up for questions. I'll try to answer a few questions before the end of our time. And then we'll pick up next week, beginning with questions and discussion, to sort of see how we go with the entire group. But in this little talk, I want to emphasize what we're after. And that is, we're after a perspective. That is, for the advanced students of this way of thinking, what really this is about is an emergent new worldview in history, right? A new cultural location, a new type of consciousness. But that's a bit overstating it at this point, because developmental politics can be extremely useful just by this perspective alone. Right? You don't need a new worldview. You know, people have a right to be who they are, and wherever you are politically right now, I'm not asking you to change your political position. What I'll be asking you to consider to do is to expand the scope of what you can value, even while you retain your current political loyalties. So the perspective, one way of thinking about what this perspective is that it's a perspective that's outside and above. In other words, we're looking down at the culture war rather than being trapped in one side of politics or one particular ideology. We're taking a step out, not necessarily permanently, but just to get a vantage point, which we call higher ground. And I'll justify why we think we can get away with calling it higher or outside and above. But the substance of this perspective, which we'll be examining and developing throughout the course, one way of describing it that we found has got a decent amount of traction is the idea of cultural intelligence. Right? So since emotional intelligence was popularized by Daniel Goleman in the 90s, everybody wanted to be culturally intelligent when they heard about it. There's now a wide range of different intelligences that are talked about, for example, in the leadership literature. But if you Google cultural intelligence, the way it's talked about now among consultants and in business circles is more like cultural manners, business manners. Like when you go to Japan, right? You're supposed to know that you present your business card by bowing, right? That's what they mean by cultural intelligence. What we mean by cultural intelligence is somewhat different. It's this ability to recognize culture, to see into it, to see into its structures, to see into its tensions, to see into the trajectory of its development more clearly. Again, this politics of culture it depends upon an enlarged cultural perspective. That cultural perspective is gained by stepping outside of the current political spectrum and reviewing or broadening our understanding of all the different political factions within the United States from this perspective of cultural intelligence. And so cultural intelligence is a class in its own, but I just want to mention it here as another way of describing this perspective, this outside and above perspective that we're after. I think I can define, just like I wanted to define culture, I want to define perspective. It's simply the dictionary definition of the faculty of seeing all the relevant data in a meaningful relationship. So the entire culture of America is in a whole series of meaningful relationships, both micro and macro, and understanding not only the participants of those relationships, but the relationships themselves, their dynamic interaction and how they've gotten stuck is what this perspective can do and why it's worth working to adopt. Part of the way so in the slogans like cultural intelligence and the politics of culture and all these different ways of describing what this view of politics is, some people are triggered by the idea of higher ground. Like, who are you to say that you're higher? Aren't you setting yourself above everyone else? And I think that's a valid critique that deserves to be responded to. We want to make the world a better place, right? We want to make politics in America better, and indeed in Italy and all over the developed world where polarization is increasing. And so when we want to make things better, I argue from a philosophical perspective, we can't flinch with our duty to say what's better. But rather than either just have an absolutistic, this is better and this is worse, or a relative perspective that says we can't really say what's better or worse, we want to improve our definition of improvement itself. Or we want to develop our concept of better, or our concept of development. And that means we have to put a stake in the ground about what's better. So what is better? I think more inclusivity is better. I mean, that is when you move from a perspective of ancient tribes people who saw their tribe only as worthy of moral consideration, their blood kin, because the other tribes were trying to kill them, right? And then there was an evolution from a sort of a family-centric or tribal-centric sense of morality to a more ethnocentric. In other words, the people who count, who are morally worthy, are the people who are members of your religion or your nationality. now we're seeing, with the rise of progressivism, the emergence of a more world-centric morality, where not only does every person count morally, but all sentient beings are worthy of moral consideration. And so that's a growth in inclusivity, moral inclusivity, the inclusivity of care. And I believe, and I think I can make the argument, if anybody wants me to elaborate further, that this is an authentic way we can talk about better. But it's not the only dimension of better. Indeed, we could talk about the intrinsic values of the good, the true, and the beautiful are ways that we can make things better. And while different forms of culture are not absolutely better or absolutely worse in stark terms, there is this growth of inclusivity. The reason that we can say this perspective is higher is that I think it has more explanatory power. It can explain why 74 million people, voted for Donald Trump, why 82 million people, or however number it was, voted for Joe Biden. We can understand what motivates people more effectively when we gain this perspective of cultural intelligence. And I think the justification for higher or better or outside and above that I like the best is that from this perspective, it allows us to appreciate a wider spectrum of value. I'm going to argue in classes to come how value can be profitably understood as a kind of energy. We're energized by that which attracts us, that which motivates us and compels us. And so when we think of value as something we metabolize, just like you can increase the health of your body by metabolizing better nutrition, well, this perspective, as I hope to demonstrate, allows us to metabolize a greater quantity and quality of value. And one of the ways we talk about the evolution of consciousness itself is by expanding the scope of what people can value. And that idea is really based on one of my favorite ideas in all of philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead, who is an eminent philosopher, one of the founders of integral philosophy. He actually defined evolution at every level in the universe as the capacity or the increase in the capacity to experience what's intrinsically valuable. So this is a sort of a consciousness-centric definition of evolution, which recognizes the growth of the world in terms of entities that can perceive value. And the difference between the prokaryotes and chimpanzees is that chimpanzees actually can experience greater intrinsic value. They have a limbic system, right? They have a family. And as humans emerge, we can experience a whole wider range of value, and we continue to grow our ability, our horizon of potential improvement expands. That's one way of conceiving the evolution of culture itself. So this higher ground perspective and the development of culture does have some empirical backing. One of the places that I point to in terms of evidence for the evolution of culture beyond anecdotal evidence of things are different than they were in the 50s is the World Values Survey. And this is a multi-decade sociological survey of values that's been initiated by the University of Michigan. Ronald Engelhardt was founded in the 70s, and it's surveyed values in 190 countries. They've got a gigantic database, and they show that since the 1950s, there's been a significant growth in value perspectives in the developed world. They use the terms allegiance values, right? Sort of traditional, you're allegiant, you conform. The move from allegiant values to assertive values, like people want what they want. They're politically active. They have grievances, right? That's a kind of a move. And then the World Values Survey also charts the emergence of what they call post-material values. And this is what we would call progressive values. So we can say more about the empirical foundations of this, although what I'm describing is political philosophy. It's not social science. We certainly want to learn everything we can from social science, but we're not limited in our observations to only what social science can say. I can also talk about this perspective from another important perspective that many of you people are familiar with, and that is one of probably the world's most prominent and respected developmental psychologists. He teaches at Harvard. His name is Robert Kegan. And he's written many books about the evolution of consciousness, primarily from a psychological point of view. And Kegan's developed what he calls the subject-object theory. The idea being that one of the most straightforward ways that people's consciousness evolves is that they take what was previously their subject, what had them, and they're able to step outside of it and see it from the outside. They're able to make subject into object. So, for example, people who grew up in a religious household, who are deeply religious and have loyalty to the teachings of their religion, which is a beautiful thing. I'm certainly not disparaging that. But for many people who are traditional religionists, when they are confronted with facts or science that contradicts their religion, they have to kind of construct reality to match their subjective religious view. They're captured by it. And when they evolve, when they grow in their perspective, they may still have their same religious loyalties. They may still identify with that religion, but they're able to see it from the outside. So the way Keegan puts it is that, that the religion, they have the religion, that the religion no longer has them. And that's true not only of religions, it's true of all of these worldviews. The ability to step outside of it is an evolutionary move. And that's really a way of describing this perspective, this outside and above perspective, which we'll be unpacking and developing in the weeks ahead. We Jeff Salzman and I interviewed a guy, he's about to come on our post-progressive podcast, Charles Johnston. He's one of the pioneers of polarity theory. He's not really an integralist, but he's very integral from our perspective. He said something that sort of was a light bulb for me. He calls it integrative meta-perspective. This perspective that I'm talking about, that's integral consciousness in its fully developed form. He says, integrative meta-perspective is new to humans. It's a newly emerging capacity that we've never had. And so that's what I hope to deliver, ultimately in this course, is an integrative meta-perspective, because it's from that perspective that the conflicts of politics can be more easily worked with. So let me finish by just reading this brief quote from Developmental Politics. Think of the problems we could solve if we can only agree about the best solutions. Given the requisite political will, we could decrease carbon emissions while sustaining economic vitality. We could reduce economic inequality while safeguarding economic freedom. We could end homelessness while preserving our collective expectations of self-reliance. And we could even create an effective healthcare system that ordinary Americans could afford. We could accomplish all of these political goals and many more like them if we could only overcome the cultural divisions that prevent one half of the country from agreeing with the other. And so that's really the promise of this, is that not only can we end the culture war and reduce the torn fabric of our society, but we can also start to get things done. Amazing things that the government used to do, like in the 40s and 50s. I think that there's actually, I will argue that there's the potential for a golden age ahead, a new age of cooperation, and that's one of the promises not only of a new politics of culture, but a transcendent and inclusive new worldview. So the good news in all of this hyperpolarization and torn fabric of our society is that it does prevent a golden opportunity for America to evolve into a better version of itself. The theory of spiral dynamics makes it very abundantly clear that it's the problematic life conditions that are the major driver of evolutionary growth. And so we have extremely problematic life conditions in our democracy at the moment, and this might lead to regression. There's no promises for the golden age, but I do believe that these conditions, if we work with them appropriately, can lead to the better version we all hope to be part of. So that's about the end. Let me just take a couple of questions. Anybody who needs to sign off right at the hour, feel free. But let me just, if there's any brief questions I can answer right now, I'll take those, and then we can have some more questions when we start next week.
Thanks. And I just want to add that in general, we'll try to stick pretty precisely to the 7 to 9. We knew today we wanted everyone to get a chance to meet each other, and so that also in the future will be, after Steve speaks, there'll be breakouts and a more conversation time. But today we wanted to make sure we got through some material. So just so that folks know. Thank you. And if you have questions or thoughts, feel free to either unmute yourself or you can raise your electronic hand, whatever or raise your actual hand. But I can't promise I'll see your actual hand. Just a minute. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question. Hi, Steve. Thanks for being with us. And so my question is, so my understanding of some of integral theory as it's presented is, so it's this like evolution and sort of the next stage in this like cultural evolution of consciousness, and sort of the stages sort of progress from, sort of like modernism to progressivism to integral consciousness. And what I sort of noticed from sort of this group in this class is it seemed like there seemed to be a pretty strong bias towards people coming to this course with a like liberal or progressive worldview. And so my question is, in your experience in teaching this and talking about, like, do you find that individuals who tend to adopt an integral worldview like tend to come more from like progressive and liberal backgrounds, or is there sort of an equal split of people coming, from more conservative or modernist backgrounds to adopting, and sort of also, do you have any sort of thoughts?
Sure, that's an excellent question, and it's one that we're wrestling with in the Institute for Cultural Evolution in terms of how can we attract and magnetize a political movement, right, toward that can embody this perspective. There's a central kind of a dogma in developmental psychology that you can't skip stages, and I actually have a critique of that. I think that's actually that misunderstands the nature of what these cultural structures are. But I'll kind of save that critique for another week. Let me just say that certainly the majority of people who are attracted to integral are coming from some form of progressive culture. But we're finding now that because many of the problematic life conditions that are pointing to some need to get a broader perspective, that those are coming from progressivism itself. I mean, we could talk about the people who looted the Capitol. I mean, there's plenty of trouble on all sides. I intend not to bash progressivism in this course. But it's progressivism, it's problematic life conditions that are really catalyzing the emergence of this next phase. So before, at least for the last 20 years, the majority of people who've been attracted to this way of thinking have been coming from progressivism. Either they're still rooted firmly in it, or they're kind of disillusioned with it and looking for something more, but they don't want to go, to the right. But more and more, we're finding many folks who are magnetized to our message who don't like progressivism. They're sort of threatened by it. They really believe, in the liberal values of modernity, and they see progressivism as a threat to that. There are also people who are deeply religious, right? And so I think we talk in terms of these colors, right? Many people are familiar with them. Progressivism, we use the color green. I won't revert to that, but just for purposes of this discussion, we thought that the main audience for this integral perspective was what we call exit green, right, or exit progressivism. But we're now finding people who are exit orange, meaning that they're dissatisfied with modernity, but they're not ready to identify as progressive. They can see that progressivism has some good points, but they also feel somewhat allergic to it or repelled by it. And so certainly the perspective which I advocate, this perspective of cultural intelligence, like I said, it embodies the polarity of those who want to make things right and those who want to preserve, those who want to preserve what's right and fix what's wrong. This prime political, heritable, biologically based polarity that's within us. The idea is to awaken it within us, whatever pole we find ourselves in, to bring in the other pole. And so a big part of this class will be helping progressive people appreciate not just classical liberals, but even the people of good sense and good faith who voted for Donald Trump. And so the idea that someone of good faith and good sense could vote for Donald Trump, that's something I hope to explore and debate with you all. And so that's the beginning of an answer to your question, but it's such a rich and excellent question that it's going to take us a while to unpack that more fully.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay, can we do one more question, one more brief one?
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or raise your little blue virtual.
I'll do one if there's nobody else. Steve, thank you for this. And I know we have a really wide spectrum in here. I'm with you all the way. And the place where I feel challenged holding the spectrum is when you get into sort of the red warrior, mean the power over stuff that we're seeing played out in a lot of the GOP. And I was just fine all the way up through the impeachment trial. And I noticed that, like, watching what's happened since, and Trump's, kind of like all the pundits talking about how he really owns the party. Watch what happened to the Louisiana Senator Cassidy, and really easy to hold, Adam Kinzinger or Liz Cheney having a harder time, not spiritually, I mean, not at a human level, but at like what the moves are politically. There's sort of we've got to squelch it. And then there's the developmental, we've got to talk to these people, everybody belongs, and no, but there are certain things where we need a hard line. And that's probably way too long of a question for you to even touch tonight, but I'm just hoping we can really get into it. And if you want to go there now, I'd be happy.
Excellent. You're queuing it up, because next week, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in much greater detail, with much more conversation, because we won't have all these introduction stuff that we've spent this time. We'll have a full 2 hours unpacking that, and I promise to address that question in detail, and I invite you to follow up, and let's keep digging into that. In other words, we will look at the pathologies that every one of the worldviews that are vying for dominance in our political, and every one of these worldviews has a kind of fundamentalism. And that's one of the pathologies, but there's other ones. So this ability of cultural perspective, it's not just a cozy kumbaya, we're all one. Part of the way that we can integrate is we're able to tease apart what we call the dignities from the disasters, right? Each one of these political positions has very important dignities. We want to carry those forward, but the only real way to do that is to make the distinction between these disasters or these pathologies that continue to plague us, and really that's why people are so polarized, is that they see the other folks primarily for their disasters. So that's a great subject. And so for next week, right, my request is that you look at, if you have the PDF of Developmental Politics, or maybe some of you have the paper book. If you didn't get the PDF, email Caroline and she'll send it to you, because I'm giving the book to everybody in the class. Please don't share the PDF with anybody else. But in the PDF is chapter 2 and 3. Those two go together. They're not that long. It's quick reading. If you get a chance to read those two chapters before next week, and bring a question in mind, and we'll try to answer all the questions up front, even if it takes us 45 minutes to get through them, because that'll be part of the fun. So that concludes our course for this evening. Like I said, the train's leaving the station and it's going to pick up speed. So I look forward to seeing you all back here next week for a very juicy class on the evolution of worldviews.